Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Malena Sparano, and I'm presenting my thesis research entitled Cross-Linguistic Queerness, a Phonetic Study of How Bilingual Mandarin-English Speakers Index a Sapphic Identity. Oh, and for this research, um, I was looking into phonetics, which is the study of sound, and bilingual research. And you might be wondering, well, why phonetics, why sound? I was really interested initially with lexical indexing of identity, so how people use specific vocabulary terms and identity, but I really wanted to study the both conscious and subconscious ways our language and linguistic variety shares to other people how we are presenting and who we are. And so through my research, I also wanted to look into bilinguals and the interplay of multiple languages on a person's identity. So I landed on my research question, which is how do bilingual Mandarin English speakers actuate a Sapphic identity, and is one language perceived as more productive to index their Sapphic identity? So if you're asking yourself right now, what is Sapphic? It's basically a gender expansive term meaning non-men attracted to non-men. There's been historically a lot of research done into heteronormativity and gay male speech, and I wanted to work within Zeta 1981's framework to understand a more gender expansive scope. So why this group and these factors? I'm looking specifically at this presentation at creak, which is like a vocal vibration, as a prominent feature of women's speech. I'm also looking into how people index a queer identity within in-group relations. And then I wanted to see naturalistic variable understanding since experimental variables sometimes aren't accurate representations of how people use language in the day-to-day. So it's a lot about perception. For my background, there's a lot of gaps in lesbian or sapphic identities, as I mentioned earlier, a lot more research on gay male speech. There's also a gap in bilingual influences on identity. The majority of queer linguistics research at the moment focuses on monolingual identities or doesn't take into scope a more interdisciplinary and multivocalic look at how and what is influencing vocal productions. And so, who I'm in conversation with is this idea of performance, as I mentioned earlier, both subconscious and conscious, and Judith Butler's idea of a more expansive identity construction, as well as Keating et al.'s 2015 idea of different types of creek, which I'll get into, and different social salience that those carry. My methodology and frameworks include working from Lal-Zimin's sociophonetic research, as well as Wang and Tu's study onto lesbian versus straight pitch and creek of Cantonese speakers, and Baron Letts-Ross's study into English phonetics for lesbian and straight speakers. So for my data collection methods, I originally had a survey to collect perception data, which I created with Qualtrics. I also had a match guise test, which in this field of linguistics has two target speakers, which I'll get into, and two non-target speakers, all producing production data. I also included sociolinguistic interviews, which were about 40 minutes of semi-structured research with my target participants, so Sapphic bilingual speakers, because I really wanted my research to be community informed, not just in an echo chamber for academia. And I wanted to make sure that I was accurately representing the groups I was researching. And then I conducted Pratt analysis, which is a phonetics software. And after about a million hours of Pratt analysis, I was able to come to some conclusions. For my match guys test and survey for the production audios, I had four guises total, so four speakers. Two of them were Sapphic bilingual speakers, and two of them were straight bilingual speakers as a control. For who was taking the survey, I had Sapphic individuals who were bilingual speakers, again, looking at in-group perceptions of identity. I think a natural expansion of this study would be to see how other groups, queer and straight, perceive the Sapphic audios and Sapphic voice. And then for the contents of my survey, I had my production, so recording of sentences with 16 total audio files, Likert scale ratings for each of the audio files on queerness, friendliness, intelligence, and other attributes, and then demographic questions like language background, gender, ethnicity, etc. For the procedure, Following a matched guise standard protocol, I mixed the order of audios and told survey participants there were 16 total speakers, so they wouldn't realize that one of the speakers produced two audios in English and two audios in Mandarin each. And then I analyzed the audios and participant ratings with statistical modeling. I used a binary logistic regression and a simple linear regression. So, what I hypothesized would happen with my results is that the presence of linguistic variables from the literature would mark the sense of sapphicness and queerness when people listened to the audios in both Mandarin and English through a conjunction of two prominent variables, primarily the lowering of pitch and creaky voice. And creak, so those vocal vibrations I talked about, regardless of the type of production, would more saliently mark a speaker's production as sapphic by interlocutors. And so, what did I end up finding? First, I found that creak was a significant predictor of rating speech as queer. I found this within a p-value of 0.002 and an odds ratio of 2.4. So, creak in the voice of a producer actually more than doubled the likelihood of being rated as queer. Additionally, there's been a lot of prior research in women's speech that a lower pitch range more often signals a queer identity versus a straight identity. However, the lower pitch within this lower pitch range was not consistently associated with a sapphic identity in my findings, which was really interesting. And then I'll talk about this more in depth in a moment, but the type of creak had a relevant impact on queer and sapphic ratings, which was interesting in conversation with women's speech and women's identity as a whole. And fourth, out of my research, I found that language variety, so Mandarin or English, didn't have a significant effect on the rating by or on bilinguals. Essentially, both languages had similar conditions and had similar results for interpretation by bilingual interlocutors. So for Creek, the types of Creek that the speakers produced overall included majorly type 1 Creek. This is the wave form of it, which is considered prototypical Creek in Keating et al.'s framework. Type 3 Creek, which is considered a double pulse. In the waveform, so you can kind of see it looks like two double pulsing. Type 5 creak, which is considered aperiodic creak, and then type 2 creak, which is considered that prototypical phrase final vocal fry. Now, the proportion of creak this was for total speakers, so those straight and sapphic speakers. But when broken up between sapphic speakers and straight speakers, you can see that sapphic speakers had a lot of type 1, 3, and 5 creak, but they also had a noticeably large portion of type 2 creak. And for most sapphic speakers, they were accurately rated as queer or sapphic, upwards of 65% by respondents. Now, conversely, straight speakers had a lot of type 2 creak, but they also had a lot of type 5 and type 1 creak present in their vocal productions. And this led to some interesting understandings. First, the audios by straight speakers that had these type 1 and type 5 creaks were rated as neutral or more queer. And sapphic speakers' audio productions were rated as more neutral or more straight if they had type 2 creak. So, thinking about this holistically and what creak can mean when indexing sexuality and identity for female and sapphic speakers is that this type 2 creak is becoming a more generalized understanding of how people produce and understand women's voice more generally, specifically in EurAsia and Hornibrook's 2010 research, it's more affluent women and specifically people coming from California. But this type 1, 3, and 5 creek is actually, from my research, trending to show more productions from queer speakers. So my hypothesis was or showed that the presence of type 1, 3, and 5 creek in vocal productions were rated as queer, but vocal fry was rated as straight by speakers. So creek, not regardless of production type, did mark a speaker's productions as queer sapphic. Overall, queer was interpreted as a social factor that listeners associate with queerness and non-heteronormativity and can be expanded in how we understand subtle differences in interpretation by in-group members. And a expansion of this research I would like to do is to see how out-group members understand and interpret Greek and see if that plays a role in things like discrimination bias, understanding and finding community, and different community of practice rituals. These are the sources, and thank you if there's any questions.